you, everybody, and it's delightful to be here. And I'm sorry Vickie's gone because obviously she'll be back. But we obviously grew up in the same era, in the 50s and 60s. I am a typical baby boomer. I too took on nursing. So it was the career choice was either a nurse or a teacher back then. And my life has been very much framed by those early years as a nurse. The empathy I think that nurses have, the critical thinking I think that Vickie pointed out as well. But my life changed when I had the birth of my first daughter. She was born with cerebral palsy, so I unfortunately couldn't sort of stay in the career that I loved. It wasn't all that sort of possible back then. Back in those days, there was no childcare. So when you think about sort of juggling now, just think about there was nothing back then. I had 3 children under 3, and in those early days, it was quite amazing. It was quite a hectic sort of ride. And one of the things that really framed me, I think, was thinking about what would I do next. I was not, I don't think I was ever really destined to be at home as a stay-at-home mum. Not that I don't think they're absolutely wonderful, but there were a lot of other people that cooked better cakes and did the tuck shop a lot better than I did. So back in those early years, in my 20s, I'll talk about decades. In my 20s, I juggled nursing for a little while, and it did become too hard. I was a theatre sister, and being called out in the middle of the night at sort of 4 o'clock in the morning to deliver a bub by caesarean was sort of fairly hard with 3 children under 3. Anyway, so one of the things that really probably transported me into a real commitment about the not-for-profit sector and the role of women and children was when I went to the spastic centres where my daughter went in those early years. I looked at the role of the major carers, and they were women. And I thought all of the people who were making the decisions were men. The board was men, the chief executive was a man, all the people in senior positions of decision making were men. And I thought they weren't listening. They weren't listening to what the women, particularly the mums, needed. And so, to cut a long story short, I got together a group of very dedicated young parents and decided that our children were going to have a right to go to school. At this stage, my child wasn't really probably intellectually able to go to a special school. The only other choice was actually residential care. And I thought that wasn't for me. So we started, a group of us, 10 of us, we started a school in the northern suburbs. I took myself off to Canberra. I got a grant for $100,000 back in the days, Senator Don Grimes. I still remember him visibly when I walked into his room, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to start a school. I want to start a school for children with special needs." He said, "Oh, you're obviously a teacher." I said, "No, I'm a nurse." "Oh, does anybody know anything about teaching?" "No, we'll find that out later." Anyway, I came back and it was the beginning of a journey. It was the beginning of the first school for children with really severe disabilities in South Australia. We started a second school in the south, and then we started to look at closing down the residential care. Some of you may be old enough to remember there was an institution called Rua here in South Australia. Well, we then decided to actually move those people who'd been there for a long time back out into the community. And living in the community with supported accommodation and good respite care. That sort of got me started on the journey of being in a leadership position, of thinking about the decision is at the top, it's at the boards. So I sort of got onto the board of the spastic centres in South Australia, then went on to lead the National Cerebral Palsy Association across Australia, and started to really become a very strong advocate for children and also women. Part of my journey was I was way out of my comfort zone. and learning to be out of my comfort zone, and learning to think about, did I really believe in what I was actually doing? So one of the messages I want to leave you with is really think about, what is your purpose? Why do you do what you do? And never always follow your dream. You'll always have problems. You'll always have hiccups along the way, road bumps, whatever. But following your dream and being really true to who you are, you'll actually find true, really true, genuine, not just happiness, but also fulfillment. In my 30s, I had a slight change of career as well. I was asked to, because of my health background, I was asked to actually work on the National AIDS campaign in Australia. And I suddenly found this whole world of communication and communicating to very large public audiences. And I worked on that and then went on to work on breast awareness. These were the days when I remember we were doing the filming. You couldn't have a woman with breast, you know, on the television. So all of the things. There was also then around Medicare. It was the beginning of Medicare. So bringing in all of those campaigns, I got a lot of experience along the way of learning to communicate, learning to question, learning to listen to multiple stakeholders, because they've got all very different messages, and learning to pitch to different people and trying to resonate with actually what's in it for them. That was my 30s. In that sort of period of time as well, of course, I'm now on boards in the community services sector and the disability sector. And I started to see that despite my role, there was still very, very few women in leadership positions. I'd often find myself as the only woman. I do remember first going to my first national meeting and sitting there, and the chair, who was a very, very wonderful gentleman, asked me if I'd make him a cup of tea. I said, oh, sure. That was the last time I did it. But it was just that sort of, it was that typecasting. I was there, obviously, as a woman. I must be there to make the tea. In my sort of 30s and early 40s, I had this wonderful opportunity to go to the US and do a month's leadership program for women, and it transformed me. Vickie, you were very lucky to live in the US. It was a decade ahead of Australia. It really was, and I'll never forget being there with women that seemed so confident, seemed so self-assured, seemed so well-spoken, and there I was, the little girl from Oz. In this month, you had to develop something called what would make you passionately delighted, but what was something that would be really challenging for you to do, called a breakthrough project. So I was sitting in there and I thought, I think I might start a business. I think I might start a women's leadership business. So on the way home, I was on the plane, I was thinking about it, much to my husband's horror when I came home. I'm now going to start a business, no business acumen at all. And that became a decade of around the country running leadership programs for women. A lot of them were here in South Australia, also nationally in Canberra and Victoria, an enormous number of women in the public sector. I was really delighted when one of the things, I was working with a group of women in Canberra, and we decided what would be a breakthrough project for women in Canberra. And there was people here, you will remember the name of Sue Varden. Sue Varden was in the group. And they said, well, actually, there's only ever been one woman Deputy Secretary in the whole history of Australia. One woman. We're talking in the late 80s here, 90s. And so we started what we called the 5 in 5. Let's try and get 5 women as Deputy Secretaries in 5 years. Once you put a goal out there, and this is the other thing I want to leave you with, once you have a compelling vision or a compelling goal, all sorts of things will start to happen. And 5 years later, there were 5 women as deputy secretaries in this country. And that transformed this country to realise for women that they can achieve. All they needed was a step up and some support along the way. So in that time, I also was doing a lot of work around getting women onto boards. And that's when I first met Sandy in the Office for Women, and started a program, Why Women, Why Boards, Why You? And the reason for that was pitching to young women like yourselves, thinking about where could you contribute, what would be your value proposition, and how would you then go about it? Well, I think there was at least a couple of hundred here in South Australia that did that program. And then my business partner, Virginia Hickey, and I took it nationally, and over the course of the next year, over 1,000 women did the program. As I look through some of the boards today, whether they be public sector, not-for-profit, or even private ASX-listed boards, I feel a great sense of pride when I see the names of some of those women that have stepped up to take on that role. So I think in my 50s, I then decided to focus a lot more on governance myself and my boards, and really giving back in many ways. I've been on a lot of government boards, I've been on a lot of not-for-profit boards, and I've been on private sector boards. I guess my passion is the not-for-profit sector. I'll tell a very interesting story that is a health story, Vickie. I was appointed the independent chair to amalgamate the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and the Lyell McEwen to become the North West Adelaide Health Service. No easy task. I had 10 board directors down one side from Queen Elizabeth Hospital, a lot of doctors, and 10 down the other side from the Lyell McEwen. Of course, a very different hospital, much more community focused, and certainly it's where the resources needed to go. 3 years, really hard work of getting it amalgamated, a lot of consultation, a lot of listening, a lot of engagement, a lot of tough decisions to be made. I did resign from that board when the minister changed his mind to unamalgamate it after 3 years. It gets down to you put your personal integrity on the line, and at times you just have to walk away. I tell that story because there'll be things you need to walk away from in your career. Being a leader is not being frightened. It's doing what's right for you, doing what resonates for you, being your authentic self. If it's not authentically you, don't do it. So now here I am in my 60s. I'm a grandmother of 3, delightful, and nearly 4, I think any day now. And I spend a lot of my time mentoring. And it's one of the most wonderful things I do is giving back, particularly to women, in seeing them grow, seeing them supported, seeing them go on their journey, whatever that journey might be. One of the things for me was actually having a mentor. I've had quite a few mentors throughout my life. I remember the first one who mentored me to go on to quite significant boards. He was a businessman. And he said, "You're a really lovely young woman, Anne, but you really need to listen to me." And I realised what he was really trying, being in a mentoring relationship, it's a two-way street. You do need to listen and you do need to respond. So part of that is mentors are there to challenge you, to give you a different perspective, to give you a different view of the world. They're not just there to actually say yes. They are there to confront, a lot of the time, our blind spots. So I think for me, in summing up, there's 5 things I want to leave you with. Get out of your comfort zone. It's where you do your greatest learning. Learn to take risks. Learn to live on the edge. Learn to be where you want to be. When the adrenaline's pumping, you will be at your best. I do remember 2 things that my coach and mentor told me. One is it's a little bit like standing on the edge of the diving board, jumping and inventing water on the way down. That's what it feels like. The other thing I think is really powerful for women is we're very afraid to get no. And one of the tasks I had on my leadership program was in 24 hours, I had to go and collect 20 no's. I thought this would be dead easy. So the facilitator was out from the States, and we were here in Adelaide, and we were going to the theatre. And so we pulled into the Festival Theatre car park, and she said, this would be a good time to start getting your no's. Ask him to park your car. I said, we're in Australia. We don't do that here. Anyway, I asked him. He said, yeah, sure. Just leave it over there, lady. Leave the keys in it and I'll park it for you. I thought, okay. So we're now in the theatre, and she said, would you lean over and ask that woman behind me if I could borrow her coat? I'm totally uncomfortable with this. Very uncomfortable. So I leaned over and said, excuse me, my friend's very cold. Would you mind her coat? Sure. Over comes this beautiful red coat. So I'm now 12 hours in, I've got no nose, right? And so the last one was the next day in the supermarket. I said to this woman, can I take your baby home? She said, no. I went, yes. Goodness knows what I was going to do. She said, sure. But what that exercise told me was how far out we have to go to get a no. We limit ourselves by our own context of stretching out and pushing the boundaries. So when you think about that, just think about how many no's do I need to collect. Vickie said it before, find a coach, find a mentor. There's lots of fabulous people out there that will do this for you. It is a wonderful journey to go on with mentor. Learn to communicate. And by that I mean effectively, listen more, say less, ask more questions. Learn to be fascinated. Learn to be fascinating. Fascinated rather than fascinating. So learn to be curious. That's how you find out. That's how you develop that sort of awareness and that empathy for others. And one, I think, I've always said, be present. Be present to the moment. What is actually happening is happening now. It's called mindfulness now, but practicing that wherever you are, being present to the one communication you might be having, the interaction, be totally present. And most of all, never lose your sense of humour and fun. It's a great journey. Wish you well.